It's so weird the way it does things. It is. How could I turn that on, have a video of me when that cover is over it? At all. At all. Didn't do anything with my hair. Should have. During the interim. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We are here on day 262 in the classroom. I'm the teacher. Hope you're watching. Hope those numbers don't mean anything to you. They don't mean anything to me. Some things never change. It's October 22nd, but I do learn, Trav. Just letting you know. So some things do change. I do learn. 18, 19, and 20 are today's chapters on Anselm, the reluctant archbishop, 1033 to 1109. You know, it always takes me a minute to get their name rolling off my tongue. I'm sorry about that, because it really does make a debauchery of the thing I'm reading. Chapter 19, Francis of Assisi. I know that one. Simple Face, 1183 to 1226. Sit down, Lucy. That's all you get. And chapter 20, Thomas Aquinas. The Not So Dumb Ox, 1225 to 1274. I remember this book was on our bookshelves in elementary school, and we did book reports. We did reports on people of the church. So they weren't all Catholics, but in the beginning they were all Catholics, weren't they? Not every one of them. These are really interesting. But I remember Francis of Assisi, for sure. That's how I learned about that saint. And I do really like the Prayer of St. Francis, for sure. Another one that feels like it's from God because it brings me to tears. Let's not do that again. I believe that I may understand Anselm Proslogian the first. 3,000 years ago, King David wrote a psalm that states, "A fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Psalm 14:1. Atheism is not a new religion. Not so long ago as David, another man wrote about the existence of God and did so with such clarity and logic that he could be considered the atheist's worst nightmare. His name was Anselm. Anselm's life was punctuated with the word no. When he was 15, he wanted to join the local abbey in northern Italy, but Gundulf de Candia, his father, had other ideas. He wanted his son to go into politics, but Anselm wasn't so inclined. Not wanting to take his father's advice, he personally approached the abbot to plead his case. However, without Anselm's father's permission, the abbot would not allow Anselm to join the abbey. Anselm didn't give up easily. He prayed about the matter, but not in the usual way. He prayed that he would become severely ill, hoping that the abbot would then feel compelled to take him in. He indeed became ill, but he endured his sickness outside the walls of the monastery. He left home. That's a little twisted, Anselm. He left home at last at the age of 27 and spent several years traveling. In Normandy, he came upon the monastery at Bec. Oh, I do get sometimes allergies. They've been really... That's okay. I'm going to be sniffling for a little bit. Sorry. He left home at the age of 27 and spent several years traveling. In Normandy, he came upon a monastery at Bec. The abbot, Lafranc, took him in and trained Anselm to become a monk. Within 3 years of Anselm arriving at Bec, Lafranc was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, a significant church position across the English Channel. Unwanted recognition. Here we go again. There's a problem with being very good at what you do. You get promoted. Maybe. If you're a guy. Soon, you get ostracized if you're a gal. Soon after Lafranc left Bec, Anselm was given his role as abbot. Under his leadership, the abbey gained a reputation for scholarship. Still, Anselm appeared to resent the time he had to spend on administration, which deprived him of opportunities to study. He asked his bishop to relieve him of some of his pressing duties as abbot, but instead of being granted relief, he was told that he should prepare himself for greater work. That is interesting because that's a Bible story. Here's the stories, folks. Now live them out in your own way. Maybe, I don't know. It was a lot of time, is what I mean. And it is. Unwanted recognition. There's a problem with being very good at what you do. You get promoted soon after. Oh, did I ever read the whole thing? Yeah, right? Yes. It was not an easy appointment. King William II of England didn't want Anselm, and Anselm didn't want Canterbury. Both men were happy to keep their distance from one another, but several years passed and William became extremely ill. Not wanting to die in his sin, he tried to make amends for some of his behavior by installing Anselm as archbishop. Anselm believed his age, health, and disposition would keep him from being a good archbishop, and so resisted the appointment. However, William insisted, and at that time it was his decision to make. Anselm had little choice but to relent, but in his acceptance he put forth 3 conditions. King William had to return land taken from the church. He had to acknowledge the authority of Pope Urban II, with whom he had been at odds, and he had to accept Anselm's spiritual authority. Those requirements were accepted by the king. Anselm would live out his days in the position and be buried on the church grounds in 1109. Contributions. Anselm's 2 greatest contributions during his long ministry have endured through the centuries. First, while still at the abbey in Bec, he developed what has come to be known as the ontological argument. His goal was to prove the existence of God. Anselm's approach is highly philosophical and a tad difficult to comprehend for those not trained in philosophy. The heart of the ontological argument is that God is the greatest being we can conceive. We can't conceive of a being greater. In Anselm's worldview, that meant there must therefore be a God in reality. In our age, which depends upon evidence rather than arguments of logic, this sounds a tad iffy. Still, it had a great influence on theology for years. Anselm's other great contributions is the theological proclamation that Jesus, as God in the flesh, did for humankind what it could not do for itself. During the early centuries of the church, a view of the atonement, the reconciling of humanity with God, called the ransom view, was the accepted doctrine. This view taught that when Adam and Eve sinned, all humankind became Satan's hostage. When Jesus came and died on the cross, he ransomed us from the dominion of Satan. So Jesus' death paid the price for our freedom from Satan, a ransom. And many religions, including Jehovah's Witnesses, call Jesus the ransom sacrifice. Evangelicals, the ransom sacrifice. It was the ransom price. You have to pay a ransom for the captive. Who's the captives? All of God's children. What's the ransom? Jesus. Oh, not enough. I can hear some great land saying, oh, not enough. And some believe this view to be wrong. Satan wasn't owed anything by God. Sin offended God, not Satan. God was loving, but it was also his nature to be just. In Why God Became Man, Anselm argued that Christ's death was not a payment of ransom to Satan, but rather a way of satisfying God's perfect and just nature. People lack the ability to do anything to be forgiven. So Jesus did for them what they could not do for themselves. Of course, in Christian thinking, Jesus is God in the flesh. No one, said Anselm, but the God-man can make the sacrifice by which man is saved. Nearing death, Anselm told his monks that he was ready to leave this life. He just wanted to do one more thing, address Augustine's question about the soul's origin. He could not think of anyone else who could do the work, but it was not to be. He died only a few days later. History is often changed by war, by disaster, or by great discoveries. But sometimes it is changed in quiet ways by men who shun the power and trappings of politics or powerful business. Anselm's revolution was one of the mind of Christian thinking. Anselm made a contribution to the defense of God's existence and to our understanding of the achievement made on the cross. Most contemporary Christians may not understand Anselm's ontological argument, but most do understand that Christ died to pay for humankind's sin, a payment made to God. See, I don't know, this is not rich in anything for me, so I'm not like, oh, Anselm. That being said, it is an interesting debate. First of all, to understand ontological. An ontological is independent and mutually exclusive. What up? Yeah. Independent and mutually exclusive. And we're not giving a stats lesson. We're moving on. But you can think about that in a deck of cards. If I draw a card, never mind. I'm about to give a stats lesson, and as you can see, I really am clear and concise about all my statistic lessons. Francis of Assisi, Simple Faith, 1183 to 1226. I have done my duty. May Christ teach you yours. The last words of Francis of Assisi, recorded by his biographer, Bonaventure. That is so interesting to me because Bonaventure is the name of the place, at least up north or somewhere in Michigan. I think it's up north of Michigan, which, well, it is a franchise of a fun park. In the late 1960s, the hippie movement was in full swing. A segment of this group, especially those in the San Francisco Bay Area, were called flower children. They were easily identified by the flowers in their hair and the clothing they wore. These young people had turned their back on the hustle and bustle of the world to live a simpler life. I thought of myself as being a later flower child. I did. There have been, which is the reason why I got into peace and conflict at originally thinking about it, but there was like, what could I do with that? Nobody even cares. All those classes are getting axed at the university level for STEM courses. That was the truth. There have been many such movements in history where groups of people separated themselves from a society that they felt had lost its way. Historically, most of these groups were interested in finding new ways to satisfy their base wants and needs. Approximately 800 years ago, someone else decided to drop out of society and forge a new way of living. But what he did and why stands in stark contrast to the hippies of the 60s or any number of other radical movements through the ages. Giovanni Bernardone was born to a wealthy family in a small town 85 miles north of Rome. Today we call him Francis of Assisi, and he is, without argument, one of the more intriguing figures in church history. Several movies have been made about his life, and an equal number of classical music pieces are associated with him, including work by Franz Liszt. Scores of books and many more attitudes have been written about him as well. What is particularly ironic about his fame is that he was the kind of man who had abhorred such attention. He dropped out of society, leaving behind his inheritance and a father who disowned him, not to seek personal pleasure, but to serve God in the most humble of ways. Francis was not always self-sacrificing. His father's wealth provided young Francis the means to pursue with abandon all the pleasures he coveted. And his father, Pietro Bernardone, hoped his son would one day be knighted. When Assisi went to war with another city, Perugia, Francis signed up. He was 20 years old when he, in knightly array, marched off to war. Whatever glory he imagined war contained was lost when he was captured and held prisoner, an imprisonment that lasted a year while his father struggled to raise ransom money. When peace returned, Francis was released, but returned home very ill, perhaps from a fever he had endured during his imprisonment. His illness was lengthy and recurrent. During his recovery, Francis questioned the meaning of his life and its purpose. As time passed, he became more earnest in his search for meaning and direction. It was a slow transformation, but his self-questioning led to prayer and meditation. During this time, he began to experience dreams and visions. One such dream came as he undertook another stab at a military career in 1205. In his dream, he traveled with a knight, headed to Apulia to join papal forces there. He saw a hall with armor hanging on the walls. All the armor bore the emblem of the cross. A voice in the dream said, "These are for you and your soldiers." This he took to mean he would become a great soldier and began his journey to Apulia to join a battle, but his progress was stopped in Spoleto by another illness and another dream, one he could not misunderstand. Francis, the voice said, "who can bring you further? The Lord or a servant, the rich man or the beggar?" "Why, the Lord, the rich man, to be sure," he answered. "Then why are you following the servant instead of the master, the beggar, rather than the Lord your God? The saddles and weapons of last night's dreams are for a spiritual battle, not an earthly one." Still asleep, Francis pleaded. Then, Lord, tell me what the battle is. What is it you want me to do? Return to Assisi at dawn, and there it will be revealed to you what you are to do. That's reminiscent of Paul, but it's also reminiscent of Jonah in Nineveh. While traveling outside his city, he came across a leper. Although his first reaction was to look the other way, he did something few others would. Seeing perhaps for the first time the person behind the disease, he dismounted his horse, stepped close, knelt, and kissed the diseased skin. Francis would later clean the wounds of many lepers as part of his ministry. That same year, another formative event took place in a small, rundown chapel in Santo Damiano near Assisi. I just want to comment on the caste system and to see some of the things then that you're denying, even those people of the stature or caste or skin color, because that's what caste means, of warrior. That same year, another formative event took place in a small rundown chapel in, I already read this, Damiano near Assisi. While in prayer, Francis heard the voice of Jesus speaking from a crucifixion in the church. Francis, are you drunk? Well, you have to sort of wonder about a background of this kind of person too. I mean, maybe he was an alcoholic. I'm just saying. I'm a psychologist. I look at the psychology, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing heretical in the nature of looking into things like that. Francis, repair my church, which you see is decaying. This voice repeated the command 3 times. This again is similar to the story of Jonah and the whale. He went to Nineveh. He said, or he went as far away from Nineveh as he could, back over there to repair the church. Francis took this to mean that Jesus wanted him to repair the church building where he'd been praying. Really? He was happy to do so. Unfortunately, the task would require materials, so he sold some of the family goods to fund the repairs without permission. His father was furious. A confrontation took place in front of the Bishop of Assisi. Francis decided it was time to break ranks with the family. He disrobed, folded his fine clothing, set it on the floor, then walked away from the building. Embracing poverty. From that day in 1206, Francis would spend the rest of his life in poverty by choice. He had come to believe it was the duty of the Christian to care for those less fortunate. I did in my mind say yes to that. There's a problem over there I can see. I did in my mind say yes to that. I did in my mind give a what would you call it? You would call it like a symbol that was my intention. I just wish somebody would explain it to me. Oh, of course, then I'd be like, yeah, that's me. He had come to believe it was the duty of the Christian to care for those less fortunate. His way of accomplishing this was to give away everything he had. He donned, or I already read that. He donned the robe of the poverty-stricken and used a rope taken from the scarecrow as his belt. He begged for food, not just for himself, but for others too. Francis's greatest shame was encountering someone poorer than he. His approach to ministry was in stark contrast to what was common for the day. Most monks lived in monasteries with walls between them and the outside world. As we've seen, some of them achieved remarkable scholastic and intellectual accomplishments, but Francis was of a different mind. He believed the monks' work should be on the outside of the abbey, where the people were, where they could see with their own eyes and touch with their own hands the pain and the poverty of the land. To do this, Francis took poverty upon himself. It would seem that, given the hardships and sacrifice, few would follow him, but that assumption would be wrong. Francis never set out to create a new order of ministers. His goal was to live a solitary life, helping the disadvantaged and repairing churches. Still others were moved by his dedication to living life as described by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. The life Francis chose was severe and filled with pain, but by all appearances it gave him joy. He found satisfaction simply by being in nature. He preached to the animals, speaking to them as if they understood every word. I do that too, but I don't understand why people don't think animals do understand what you're saying. I don't understand that. I mean, I can understand a fear in a squirrel, but you could get a squirrel to approach you, you know? Why don't you understand animals understand? Of course, why they didn't understand that whole series of animals running into my vehicle, including a duck and a deer ran into my vehicle. And then I hit another deer. And then my husband hit a deer. Francis didn't set out to create a movement or establish a religious order. His goal was to live the way Jesus did, moving from place to place, preferring acts of compassion, kindness, and grace, preaching a very simple gospel, and meeting the needs of the poor and disenfranchised. Soon Francis had followers. 11 men joined him, selling what they had, embracing poverty, leaving behind a normal life for the hardship of an iterate missionary existence. Francis had no desire to leave the Roman Church. He had not trained as a priest. He was a merchant's son and little more. I am a teacher and little more. For Francis to be comfortable with the addition of others to his group, he needed the approval of the church. He wrote a simple set of rules, guidelines used by religious groups in the church, dictating their mission and motivation. Francis based his rules on 3 passages of scripture, all dealing with the sacrifice of material goods. Francis took these verses in the most literal sense and made them the game plan for his life. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" Matthew chapter 16, verse 24 through 26. And someone came to Jesus and said, "Teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may obtain eternal life?" And he said to him, "Why are you asking me about what is good? There is only one who is good. But if you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments." Then he said to him, "Which ones?" And Jesus said, "You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and your mother. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "All these things I have kept. What am I still lacking? Jesus said to him, if you wish to be complete, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. But when the young man heard this statement, he went away grieving, for he was one who owned much property. Listen, if I gave that up for this and what you're talking about, so be it. But just don't tell me they're in criminal hands by way of misjustices that have been corrected. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I know I say that a lot, but do you know what I'm saying? Somebody's got, I'm not so Hindu. See, Bookless classroom. So non-assertive, where others may define it as an aggressive tone for things that are going into criminal hands. No, the poor, yes, to help the poor, and we will always have our poor, which is 5% of the people, and that's just because I think that's around 5% from my war with the poor. We change that number based on what we want, poverty level, whatever, The third one, that was Matthew 19, 16 through 22. I think you knew that. And Jesus said to them, by omniscience. And Jesus said to them, take nothing for your journeys, neither a staff, nor a bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not even have 2 tunics apiece. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that city. Now that is a different mindset, right? That's a really different mindset. That's what St. Francis of Assisi is saying. This is what we do. We as in the order and his 11 apostles that he had. I think I like to live, among some comforts. But I don't need everyone fighting to make a, Ethiopian cotton sheet. Which who even knows if they used real Ethiopians? That's what I'm saying. These verses were revolutionary to Francis and exerted such a hold on him that he walked away from everything, things others longed to have, and into the world fully dependent upon God and the kindness of others. Those who wished to be a part of his group had to make the same commitment. Now, I could actually see my husband doing that exact thing and being so driven. There really was, when he was with me, there really was a pull on his spirit that was a very different direction than I was in. I did believe, and this is in that movie about the blacklisting of the entertainment industry. So starting with that one guy. And I could see my husband saying basically to making that kind of commitment. And Stuart, my husband Stuart. And if it wasn't to that level, it wasn't a commitment. And there'd be no way. I mean, there was a lot of levels I went down, but I also believe that you are not going to speak to the masses from your teepee in Wyoming. The 12 men arrived in Rome to seek the blessing of Pope Innocent III, to whom Francis presented his followers and their rules. When the Pope heard the request, he decided to test Francis' sincerity. Go, brother, to the pigs to whom you are more fit to be compared than to men, and roll with them, and to them preach the rules you have so ably set forth. Nice job, Pope Innocent. Way to wield that power and then put a little torture tone in there as well. Francis did as he was told, and when he returned, Innocent III gave his blessing to the group. The movement we now call the Franciscans was born. Soon 2 other Franciscan groups formed, including one for women. A young girl named Claire, just 16, heard Francis preach and was drawn to the message and the lifestyle. 2 years later, in 1212, she and Francis were granted permission to form an order for women. The group became known as the Poor Clares. A third group arose for those who because of family or business ties could not leave their homes or work. They took the same vows and supported the work of others. These were the tertiaries, the third order. Francis had left home in 1206. 12 years later, he had as many as 3,000 followers, just like the apostles upstairs with the Holy Spirit. His message and lifestyle offered something very different than what people witnessed in typical church life. Francis didn't just speak of Christ's life, he reflected it. Many of these followers, or minor brothers, friars minor, traveled as missionaries. Years after Francis's death, the missionary monk John de Monte Corvino traveled to China. By 1300, he had baptized thousands and had seen 30,000 conversions. Francis's approach to spiritual service differed from what was practiced in his day in yet another way. And there you see the threes. I don't know. Well, 12. I think these are divisions of 60, which is these mathematical equations that we're giving in, like really Babylonian times. The system was based on division of 60. And then 60 seconds for time, as well as 60 degrees in an arc. I don't know how to use that information other than there just seems to be, and then there are the sixes. And then 30,000, 3,000, 30,000 by 1,300. Just saying. Francis's approach to the spiritual service differed from what was practiced in his day in yet another way. Many monks, as we have seen, spent their lives in academic pursuits and studies. They made significant contributions to the growth of the church through their writing, but Francis was a creature of a different stripe. He was dubious about learning. He considered himself untaught and idiota. He did not consider himself stupid, just uneducated compared to the scholastic monks. He had reservations about too much learning. He feared that too much focus on books would take his eyes off spiritual leaders away from the needy. He never lost sight of the painful lives of others. He never lost sight of the painful lives others lived. That was my husband. He would rather walk from place to place and live on donated bread and water while ministering to lepers than spend his days stooped over books and ancient texts. Prior to the work of Francis, the poor had largely been overlooked in the ministry of the church. Francis brought their needs for spiritual and physical help back to the forefront of faith practice. Now, see, I worry, as I said, about the goodness of all of my family. I'm sometimes to the point of being embarrassed, but not about my husband, because he's independent of me. About my children, yeah, because they are not independent of me. I am responsible. I'll take care of my husband, but you know what I mean. But this is him right there. So if ever I doubt my husband's tenacity for good, I should just reread St. Francis of Assisi. And then back to the whole memory thing that I was talking about in the Bookless classroom. This feels so familiar. Like, thank God, yeah, he could be St. Francis of Assisi. Francis is in a reincarnation sort of aspect. See Hindu lesson. Francis's life in many ways is the stuff of legend. Accounts of his life are rife with miracles, humility, sacrifice, and amazing encounters. One of his biographers tells of an event in Spoleto, Italy, where Francis met a man with the face deformed by cancer. The man tried to throw himself at Francis's feet, but the monk wouldn't allow it. Instead, he took the man's face in his hands and kissed him on both cheeks. The man was healed. Another account goes a long way in supporting the idea that Francis and nature were closely tied. A vicious wolf had been terrorizing the Italian town of Gubbio, leaving people fearful to leave their homes. One day, Francis encountered the snarling wolf, which charged him with jaws snapping. Unexpectedly and suddenly, the beast came to a stop, ceased his attack, and lay at Francis's feet. Francis spoke to the animal, "Brother Wolf, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to do no evil to me or to any man." It is said the wolf lowered his head in agreement. Of all the strange events surrounding Francis, none is so remarkable as the stigmata he endured toward the end of his life. In 1224 on Mount Pena, while in prayer and fasting, he had another vision, an image of Christ nailed to the cross. When the vision ended, he felt pain in his hand, feet, and side. He was bleeding. The term stigmata is based on the Greek word stigma, which refers to a mark like a dot made by the point of a pen. Later, stigmata came to mean a mark associated with some particular event and is often used in a negative way. Stigmatas refer to the marks on the human body that correspond to the wounds of Christ on the cross: pierced hands, pierced feet, and a spear wound in the side. Francis came out of the vision bleeding as if he had been crucified. In many Christian circles, this is taken as a sign of deep religious fervor and a desire to suffer as Christ did. Francis fit that description. I actually remember seeing a vision of someone being hoisted on the cross. That person being hoisted on the cross. And I looked for the stigmata. That part I don't remember. It seems like it goes so fast, is what it seems like. It's like you have to see it immediately because then it's vaporized. That's what I feel. Latter years, Francis's health declined through the years. The stigmata was painful, and a life of hardship and poverty had taken its toll. Eventually, he went blind. Not long before he died, he wrote the Canticle of Brother Sun, again showing his love for God's creation. "Be praised, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whose embrace no living person can escape." 2 years later, Francis of Assisi, worn by a long, hard life of service to others, died singing to the Lord. Francis is not remembered as a great thinker or theologian. He was, however, a great doer. He was not a scholar. He was a champion of the poor. When he was a young man, he bruised himself having fun and dreaming of exploits. He busied himself having fun and dreaming of exploits as a knight. But everything changed after his imprisonment, illness, and subsequent personal calling from God. Respect came his way, but not as he planned. By the end of his life, he was respected, revered, and so loved that he was canonized as a saint in 2 years unusually fast for the Roman Catholic Church of the day. Francis became known as St. Francis of Assisi, leaving behind an altered church and a society open to helping the needy. Francis is often pictured with birds and other wildlife. His love of creation was genuine, but his love for those in need was greater. Francis is a reminder of how Christ lived and worked. And the thing about this that makes me sad is it's such a perspective that you end up getting sometimes of the personalities in your life, right? So as much as I see Stuart being like Francis of Assisi, I see my son Travis. And maybe Saxon, although Saxon doesn't let me see his poverty. Travis does. So by all grace, and that's the only word I can think of right now, boys, you have my blessings. I mean, I wouldn't mind answers, but apparently you can't give them to me, that this sacrifice has to be without screaming and whatever, right? And whatever it needs to be. I have always trusted my family because I think I didn't always raise them by example, but I really, really tried. And when I didn't raise them by example, I felt so incredibly horrible, provided that I was conscious of the things I was doing. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thanks so much for joining me here on Wednesday, October 22nd. It is day 262. We just got through another 3 chapters in our book, 60 People Who Shaped the Church. Who's coming up tomorrow? Oh, are we supposed to read today? Oh, we're not done. Geez, that took a long time, didn't it? Thomas Aquinas, the not so dumb ox, 1225 to 1274. Yeah, we're on 47 minutes. Reginald, I cannot, because all that I have written seems like straw to me. Thomas Aquinas, in response to Reginald of Piper Nose, urgent request to return to work. Reginald, I cannot, because all that I have written seems like straw to me. During our school days, we all saw the poor souls who were so different from other students face constant ridicule. Who were so different from others, students face constant ridicule. Maybe they stood out because they were smarter, more dedicated, shorter, awkward, socially inept, or just looked or sounded different. For many of them, the daily grind of school was an unending chain of ridicule. Every generation has a percentage of people who serve as targets for the mockery of others. Some would go on to achieve great things. Others would drop out. Some may not have fit in during their school years, but blossomed in their adult years. I went to school with several such people. One was hopelessly awkward, and he endured more emotional hardship than anyone his age should have to. Another of my classmates cared little what others thought. He had a gift for the science and spent some of his non-school hours working at the prestigious cancer research department of a nearby medical school. In his adult years, he has dedicated his time and efforts in the fight against diseases such as diabetes. The tough beginning. Around 1225, in the family castle of Lombardy, in the kingdom of Naples, a noble Italian family welcomed the birth of their 9th child, a son. His father, Landulf, the Count of Aquino, and his mother, Theodora, the Countess of Tino, named him Thomas. Even as a child, Thomas Aquinas showed a devout nature, and so his family sent him to school at a nearby abbey. He would go from there to study at the finest schools of his day. Those days were not easy. At the University of Naples, his fellow students called Aquinas the dumb ox, most likely because of his physical heft, his less than handsome appearance, and his quiet, taciturn nature. Although he might have appeared as a dumb ox to his classmates, he was not. He had a keen intellect, a dedication to study, the ability to think in the abstract, and the ability to formulate answers to complex questions. His teacher, Dominican monk Albertus Magnus, predicted the young man would change the world. We call this young man a dumb ox, but his bellowing and doctrine will one day resound throughout the world. This echoes a statement made by a holy hermit before Thomas's birth. He will enter the order of the friars preachers, and so great will be his learning and sanctity that in his day no one will be found to equal him. Albertus Magnus so impressed Aquinas that he decided he too would join the ranks of the Dominicans. But despite the pre-birth prediction of the holy hermit, his parents did not share Aquinas' spiritual enthusiasm. Monks lived a harsh life and took a vow of poverty, something his parents, people of nobility, did not want to see their son endure. They tried to persuade him to seek positions in the church that provided greater comfort and more esteem. They even offered to buy him the position of Bishop of Naples. But Thomas had no interest in this and remained determined to become a Dominican monk. His parents, apparently out of desperation, had him kidnapped and held him against his will for well over a year. In addition to his unorthodox act, they even went so far as to tempt him with a prostitute in hopes that he would leave behind the idea of being a monk. Their efforts failed. Thomas Aquinas, in spite of the wiles of his parents, would become a Dominican monk. An old philosophy made new. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, lived 1,500 years before Thomas Aquinas. While his work was well known in some parts of the world, much of it had been lost in Europe. When the thinking of Aristotle was reintroduced, it made a splash. Thinkers of every kind studied the old philosopher. Thomas Aquinas was one of them. In the church of that day, however, ancient philosophers that emphasized reason and observation were not well received. Aquinas did not let that stop him. He made it his goal to understand Aristotle and to see how much of the philosopher's thinking could be applied to Christianity and what should be dismissed. His rumination would lead to one of the most famous writings in church history, the Summa Theologica, Summary of Theology. Although he wrote other material, this book is by far his best known. In sacred theology, all things are treated from the standpoint of God, Thomas states in the beginning of his work, thus establishing his Christian approach. The book is structured into 3 parts. Part 1, theology. Part 2, ethics. Part 3, Christ. And contains 3,000 articles, 38 tracts, 631 questions, and 10,000 objections and answers. That's amazing. Did not know that. Thomas introduces each subject with a question, raises objections that others had voiced or might bring up, and replies to those objections. It was a monumental work. One recent translation runs 5 volumes and more than 3,000 pages. Impressive as that is, it is even more stunning to realize that the work is unfinished. Thomas died in 1274, leaving the work he had spent the last 9 years composing incomplete. Reasons and revelation. Thomas was a controversial scholar and his use of a pagan philosopher in his reasoning created a few enemies. Thomas made no attempt to show human philosophy as greater than the Bible. Quite the contrary. He did, however, acknowledge that human reason was useful. Thomas's scales had reason on one side and revelation on the other. To him, the two were complementary. Reason, he argued, could lead a person to a belief in God, but lacked the ability to provide the details necessary for a person to act on that faith. A person might see the endless universe and realize a creator must be involved. From such observation, generalizations could be made, but those concepts lacked sufficient detail to paint a full picture. For that, one needed revelation. Revelation is the act of God whereby he reveals what would otherwise be unknown. Today, theologians speak of general, sometimes called natural revelation, and specific revelation, sometimes called special revelation. We also talk about this in psychology as well, using those exact words, but not revelation. They have to do with memory. General revelation describes how God is revealed through observation of nature. Specific revelation is the information God made available through the Bible, prophecy, and Christ. General revelation might suggest that there is a God who loves us, but specific revelation is needed for us to know it as a fact. John chapter 3, verse 16. For example, God so loved the world as to send his only son, right? And to see how that love was displayed through Christ. Reason is limited to sensory knowledge, what we learn by observation. Revelation is detailed and personal. Reason is good. Thomas believed, but revelation was necessary. Understanding always came back to God. His teaching on reason versus revelation is appreciated by Protestants and Catholics alike. First clause, Thomas also offered 5 arguments for the existence of God. He called them ways. 3 of the ways are forms of the cosmological argument, a reasoning based on Aristotle's belief that every effect has a cause, and that cause has a cause, and that cause has a cause, and so on until we reach first cause, God, who started everything. Another one of his ways is now called the theological argument. Although teleology might not be a familiar word, the concept is simple. If we see a design, then there must be a designer. Now, that's not the way I understand that word. I understand that word as seeking. But okay. And that actually is the bottom line with intellectual design, or those people from Discovery Institute, based on Thomas Aquinas right there. If we see a design, then there must be a designer. You know, maybe not exactly that way, but yeah. The interstate freeway system did not come about by accident or a confluence of coincidence. Someone conceived of the systems of roads and designs were made. Thomas saw design in the universe as well as concepts unique to humanity, beauty, truth, and said these things could only come about if there is a God. Thomas Aquinas was Roman Catholic through and through. He believed the church was a channel of salvation, and salvation could not be apart from the church. Although many of the concepts of Roman church came about before Thomas's day, his writings gave them greater weight and would become some of the hallmarks of the world's largest church. Purgatory was one concept Thomas defended. He believed that those who are evil went straight to hell after death, while the godly went to heaven and less dedicated believers went to purgatory. Purgatory comes from a Latin word meaning purifying. It was believed, and still in the Roman Catholic Church, that the bulk of the deceased who are not holy enough for immediate entry into heaven pay for their sins in purgatory. And there is this cleansing idea, again, even in Hinduism, not even in, but starting from Hinduism. He went even further in this thinking by teaching that the living could pray for the dead and those prayers would be beneficial to those being purified. In other words, the church's influence could impact the souls of the dead. Purgatory is a doctrine rejected by Protestants and similar groups who find no evidence for it in the Bible. Thomas also defended the sacraments as having the power to impart grace to the participants. That is to help maintain salvation. He believed in the 7 sacraments: baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, Lord's Supper, extreme unction, marriage, penance, and ordinance. Perhaps the most significant of these is the Eucharist. For Catholics then and now, the Eucharist is very special and miraculous. Thomas taught transubstantiation, a belief that the elements of the Lord's Supper change physically from wine and bread to the blood and flesh of Christ. And again, this is an idea Protestants reject. Thomas defended the supremacy of the Pope, salvation through the church alone, and grace received through the other sacraments. All of this makes what Thomas Aquinas represents a conflicting bundle of ideas for Protestants who appreciate his power argument for the existence of God, but who can't accept his ideas about salvation through the church, purgatory, and transubstantiation. To Roman Catholics, however, he is one of the great teachers of the church. Unfinished work. Thomas's work is central to the Roman Catholic Church, but he was not immediately elevated to the rare position of doctor of the church. Doctor meaning teacher. Just 33 men hold that title, and there we are with the threes again. And getting on that list takes time. In Thomas's case, it took 314 years. His greatest work, the book he gave nearly a decade of labor to, was never finished. Thomas told those close to him that he had received a vision and saw things that caused him to consider all his work as straw. He put down his pen and, despite the encouragement of others, refused to take it up again. The Summa sat incomplete. We don't know that Thomas saw in the vision. We don't know what Thomas saw in the vision, but whatever it was, it took the wind from his sails. 3 months later, he died. So this would have been his rebirth to a spiritual realm according to Hinduism, and he was released from this life. That's pretty amazing. The influence of Thomas Aquinas even today is profound and widespread. 3 months later, he died. It was March 7th, 1274. He was 49 years old. One church history sums up his life this way: the influence of Thomas Aquinas even today is profound and widespread. It is seen in theology, philosophy, ethics, and in major issues facing government and other branches of society. The Christian of such a deep, broad, and lasting impact is a kind of thinker with the kind of vision that the church needs in every age. Whether we agree or disagree with certain aspects of his doctrine, one thing should be acknowledged: Thomas Aquinas must be numbered among those who shaped the church. No matter what we think, but it's worth thinking about. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We have just finished 3 more chapters, 3 more people who shaped the church. 3 out of 60 people who shaped the church. We are learning about sinners, saints, rogues, and heroes in our book by Alton Gansky. The next 3 chapters: John Wycliffe, the Protestant in Catholic clothing, from 1320 to 1384. I am ready to defend my convictions even unto death. I have followed the sacred scriptures and the holy doctors, the holy teachers. That would be me. John Wycliffe, Protestatio. Why do I feel like I read that? Nicholas Copernicus, Amazing resume. 1473 to 1543. O Lord, the faith thou didst give to St. Paul I cannot ask. The mercy thou didst show to St. Peter I dare not ask. But Lord, the grace thou didst show unto the dying robber, that, Lord, show to me. Nicholas Copernicus, his chosen epitaph. And Martin Luther, lightning strikes twice. 1483 to 1546. My situation was that, although an impeccable monk, I stood before God as a sinner troubled in conscience, and I had no confidence that my merit would assuage him. Martin Luther, Preface to Latin Writings, 1545. That sounds amazing. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thanks for joining me here in the reading room. We have just, again, as I said, completed another 3 chapters in our book, 60 People Who Shaped the Church. It is day 262 in the classroom, now ending October 22nd. Thanks for joining me as we use the reading room as a great instrument, a wonderful instrument to make our minds, our bodies, and our spirits healthier. Thanks.